This happened a couple months ago. It started like any other night, me swiping on Tinder, kinda bored. I came across this guy named Alex. He looked good in his pictures, the kind of guy you don't really expect to swipe right on you. He had that boy next door look, but with a little bit of an edge. Anyway, we matched and he seemed pretty normal in our chats, if a little eager. He wanted to meet up pretty quickly, and usually I'm cautious with that stuff. But he was charming, and I guess I thought, why not? We decided to meet at a coffee shop that's usually packed. I figured it would be safe. When I got there though, it was almost immediately off. He looked different. Not just a little different, but enough to where I almost didn't recognize him. He wasn't unattractive, but his photos had definitely been generous. Still, I thought, okay, sometimes photos can be misleading, right? Maybe it will still be fine. But as soon as I sat down, he reached across the table, took my hand and just held it, like we'd been dating for weeks or something. I pulled my hand back, kind of laughing it off, trying to play it cool, but he didn't seem to get the hint. He just kept smiling at me like we were in love or something. It was intense, uncomfortable. We started talking, but he was just all around weird. He kept bringing up things that felt way too personal, like asking if I wanted kids and what I thought about marriage, things you definitely don't ask on a first date. I tried to steer the conversation back to normal topics, like work or hobbies, but he'd answer in these vague ways, and then steer it back to me, asking if I'd ever cheated in relationships or how many people I'd dated. He kept saying things like, I can already tell you're different from other girls. I feel like we've known each other forever. It was only 15 minutes in and I already wanted to leave. At one point I mentioned that I had to leave soon, just to test the waters, and his face went cold. He looked at me kind of intense and said, but you just got here. Don't you want to spend more time with me? I lied and said I had a friend who needed me to help her with something, but he didn't take it well. He said I thought we had something real here. That's when I realized I had to get out. I told him I was sorry, but I really had to go. He kept looking at me like he was studying my every move, but he finally nodded reluctantly. I practically jumped out of my seat, said goodbye and speed-walked out of there without looking back. I felt so relieved once I was outside. I made it home without incident, but not long after my phone buzzed with a text. It was him. He was saying how much he'd missed me already, and how he'd felt a connection that he'd never felt before. I was creeped out, so I didn't reply. Over the next hour, he kept messaging, asking why I wasn't responding, and I started feeling a bit panicked. I'd only just met this guy, but he was acting like we'd been in a relationship for months. Finally, I texted him back saying, hey, I think maybe we're not looking for the same thing, but I hope you find what you're looking for. Just trying to keep it polite, you know. That's when things got worse. Immediately he replied with a long message about how I owed him for the time he'd spent with me, saying he'd opened up to me in a way he hadn't with anyone else and how he couldn't handle if I had left him hanging. He said he had nothing else in his life, and that he'd do something drastic if I didn't talk to him. At that point I was honestly freaked out. I stopped replying altogether, hoping he'd get the hint. But then the messages turned darker, saying he'd go through with it and that I'd be responsible. I'd never been in a situation like this before and I didn't know what to do. I eventually blocked his number, trying to forget about the whole thing. But when I woke up the next morning, I had a flood of new messages, all from random numbers, all saying the same things, that he couldn't live without me, that I was heartless, that I'd led him on. I ended up having to block those numbers too. It's been a few months and I haven't heard from him since, thank God, but I think about it a lot. The whole experience left me shaken and now I'm super wary of anyone I talk to online. It's terrifying how quickly someone can flip and make you feel like you're responsible for their whole world. My advice? If something feels off from the start, trust that feeling. So I went on this Tinder date about a month ago, and looking back, I don't know if I've ever been that close to real danger. I thought dating apps were just a way to meet new people and maybe even find someone to connect with, but man, I was way off. It started pretty normal. I matched with this girl named Julia. She was cute, had a nice smile, and seemed pretty down to earth. We didn't talk for long before she asked if I wanted to meet up. It wasn't exactly love at first sight, but I figured a casual night out couldn't hurt. We met up at this local bar that's always packed, good for a low-stakes date. Things were average. She was polite, laughed at my jokes, and we talked about the usual things. Our jobs, favorite movies, and random stuff like that. But the spark just wasn't there, It was fine, but I knew by the end of the night that I wouldn't be texting her for a second date. After about 2 hours, we wrapped things up. She hugged me goodbye, thanked me for the night, and I went home thinking, well, that was that. I didn't feel bad about not texting her because honestly, it felt pretty mutual. Fast forward a couple of days, and I get a random text from a number I don't know. It says, "You better back off." I figured it was some prank or spam, so I ignored it. But then, about an hour later, I get another one. This time it says, "I'm warning you, don't come near her again." I started feeling uneasy. The first text seemed random, but 2 in a row. I went over the list of people I'd been hanging out with lately, and no one came to mind. Then I remembered Julia. Could she have a weird ex? Or maybe this was a friend of hers messing with me. Either way, I didn't respond. I just blocked the number and moved on. The next day, a different number starts messaging me. This one says, "I know where you live." At this point, I'm feeling freaked out. Whoever it was had to be serious or just crazy. The text didn't let up either. By the next day, I was getting these random threats every couple of hours, always from different numbers, each one telling me to back off or stay away. One message even had a picture of my street. I didn't know what to do. I thought about calling the cops, but I wasn't sure what they could even do about random texts. I wanted to ignore it, but I was just getting more paranoid by the minute. It felt like someone was watching my every move and I didn't even know why. Then, a few nights later, I woke up around 3 a.m. to a loud noise coming from my door. I sleep with a baseball bat nearby just in case, so I grabbed it, thinking maybe it was some drunk guy or something. But as I got closer, I realized someone was actually trying to break in. I looked through the peephole, and there was this guy standing there, clearly trying to get the door open. He looked big, angry, and determined. Now, I don't usually keep my gun loaded, but that night something told me to. I grabbed it and I aimed it at the door, yelling, "I have a gun and I'm calling the cops." I figured that would scare him off, but instead he slammed into the door again, harder than before. By now, I was terrified. This wasn't just some random guy, this was someone who wanted to get me for real. I kept the gun up, my hands shaking, but thankfully he finally stopped. I could hear him muttering something outside, but he didn't leave. He just stood there, breathing heavily, as if he was deciding what to do next. Eventually, I heard sirens in the distance. I'd managed to call 911 without taking my eyes off the door. When the cops showed up, he finally tried to bolt, but they caught him in the yard. Turns out the guy was Julia's husband. Apparently, she'd been using Tinder to make him jealous, trying to get him to pay more attention to her. She'd been dating random guys and then letting her husband find out. And the whole time she'd been playing it up like the guys were the ones pursuing her. When her husband finally found out about me, he went completely unhinged, convinced I was trying to steal her from him. I was left standing there, trying to explain to the cops that I barely knew her. She hadn't mentioned anything about being married, and honestly, if she had, I would have bailed on the date right then and there. It was a nightmare, but I was just relieved that nothing worse happened. Julia's husband got arrested that night, and I haven't heard from either of them since. But I'll never forget how the date turned into one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. Now, every time I think about meeting someone new, I hesitate. You just never know what kind of mess you might end up in. I don't know if I'll ever be able to date again after this experience. It started as a regular Tinder date, nothing out of the ordinary. I matched with this girl, Emily, who seemed nice and down to earth. I'll admit, I was way more nervous than I should have been. I'm not exactly a ladies' man, and I guess that awkwardness came across pretty quickly. We met up at this bar I'd never been to before. When I got there, I tried to keep it cool, but my hands were sweating like crazy. She looked just like her pictures, which was a relief, but that only made me more nervous. I stuttered through a few sentences before finally managing to ask her what she wanted to drink. She ordered something simple, handed the bartender her ID, and we found a table in the corner. The whole time I could tell she was being polite. But the more I talked, the more I could see her losing interest. I'd laugh a little hard at my own jokes, and I could see her looking down at her phone from time to time. By the time we finished our drink, it was clear things weren't going to go anywhere. She smiled and told me she had an early morning the next day, so I took the hint and said I'd walk her out. Just as we were heading out, the bartender called over to me, saying something about an ID. I looked around, but I didn't see anyone else who could have left theirs behind, so I picked it up. Sure enough, it was Emily's. I turned to tell her, but she was already out the door, probably just as relieved to leave, as I was nervous to stay. So I figured I'd just message her on Tinder and let her know I'd found it. I sent a quick, casual message. Hey, looks like you left your ID at the bar. I picked it up so I can give it to you when you got the chance. No response. I thought maybe she just missed it or didn't have her notifications on, so I waited until the next morning to try again. I sent her another message, this time just as simple. Hey, still have your ID if you want to meet up and grab it. No worries if you're busy. Still nothing. I started wondering if maybe she'd unmatched me or blocked me because it was just too quiet. Later that day, I tried one more time, figuring she might have seen my profile and decided she didn't want to talk to me again. This time I sent a slightly longer message saying I'd be happy to leave it at the bar if that was more comfortable for her. But that's when things started to go downhill. A few hours later, I got a text from an unknown number. I opened it up and it read, "Stop trying to contact me. I don't want to see you." I froze. I didn't even have her number, so how did she know it was me? I started to realize she must have really thought I was some kind of creep. I replied back saying I only wanted to return her ID, but no response came through. I figured I'd just leave it be for now and maybe try again in a few days. Then, the next day, there was a knock on my door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I peeked out the window, and there were 2 police officers standing on my porch. My heart started pounding and I opened the door, trying to keep calm. They asked if they could come in for a quick chat, and I had no idea what was going on. One of the officers explained that they were responding to a call from a young woman who had claimed I'd taken her ID and was using it as an excuse to keep contacting her. Apparently, she'd felt so uncomfortable with my messages that she'd reported me to the police. I tried explaining everything, how she'd left the ID at the bar, how I'd only messaged her about returning it, but I could see from their expressions that they weren't entirely convinced. They asked if they could see her ID, so I went and grabbed it from my jacket pocket. One of them took it, inspected it, and looked back at me. He said that, technically, they couldn't tell me what to do, but they advised me to drop it off at the station or mail it back to her and to stop all contact. I felt humiliated, like I was some kind of creep or stalker, and they were just politely suggesting I stop my behavior before it got worse. So that's what I did. I went straight to the post office and mailed it back to her with no note, no explanation. I wanted her to know that I wasn't trying to keep it, but at this point I was too freaked out to keep explaining myself. The police had advised me not to try to contact her again, and honestly, I didn't want anything more to do with it. Looking back, I keep wondering if there was something I could have done differently. Maybe I should have just left it at the bar that night instead of picking it up in the first place. Or maybe I shouldn't have tried messaging her multiple times even though I was just trying to be helpful. Ever since, I haven't opened Tinder once. The whole experience just makes me sick to my stomach, thinking about how easily a simple misunderstanding turned into a full-blown nightmare. It's made me paranoid about dating apps and about how quickly things can spiral out of control.